All right, we're back in the Rust-Oleum Garage with the dresser that we thrifted. I'm so excited to take you through the steps of how we're gonna make over this dresser and give it a whole new look. So the first step in a makeover after I get the piece of furniture is that I like to make sure that I have a vision for what I want the dresser or the piece of furniture to look like in the end. This is gonna give us a great starting point so that we can then assess the dresser and really figure out what exactly needs to be done in order to get the look that we want. So on this specific dresser, I'm thinking that I wanna add some color to it. There is just all one color right now, and it's pretty outdated. All of the pine that's going on. I think we want to cover all of the wood down here on the base, but then I also want to warm it up a little bit and keep the wood solid, a wood look. So we're going to stain the top, paint the bottom, and then of course we're going to get rid of these wooden knobs that are very outdated and match the dresser, and we are going to add new hardware. So in order to get started, the first thing after I have my plan is that I need to remove that hardware and give this a really good clean so that we have a nice fresh slate to start with. So like I said, the first thing that I'd like to do is remove the hardware. And this is really important because a lot of the times there's going to be gunk and dust underneath the hardware. So when you're cleaning, you want to make sure that you had it all off so that you can clean under each hardware piece as well. Then you can set these aside, and depending on what the hardware looks like, you can either keep them or you can donate them to the thrift store or even throw them away. All right, and now that we've got all of the hardware off, it's time to clean with the Krud Kutter. So when you're cleaning, you like to go ahead and glove up, and then we've got our Krud Kutter, which is a multi-purpose cleaner, but it also has a degreaser in it. So it is going to make sure and get all of the oils off of the surface so that our product will really be able to stick and adhere well to the surface. I just like to give it a nice liberal coat wherever you are going to clean. Okay, now that all of the cleaning is done, like when I'm cleaning, I really like to make sure that I'm assessing the piece as well, making sure that I'm looking out for any damages that need to be filled in and things like that. In this dresser, there really isn't a ton of like really large gouges, but if there were, this would be a great time for you to use wood filler and fill in any of those gouges that are going to be really visible. If you miss some in this stage, you can always go back and put some more wood filler on smaller superficial marks after you've done the primer, and that's probably what I'm going to do on this piece. So that means now we are ready to go into the sanding portion. Let's talk about sanding. First, I'm going to talk about the top, how we are going to sand the top. We learned at the thrift store that this is a veneer top, which basically means that there is a layer of a little bit of a cheaper material, whether it be plywood, particle board, MDF, underneath a very thin layer of wood. In this case, it's pine, and that is glued onto the top of that thicker layer of the cheaper material. So we want to be really careful when we're sanding the top here because we don't want to sand through the veneer since it's so thin onto the next layer because it would be very blotchy and it really wouldn't be able to be stained and still look good. So even though we need to be careful, generally when you are sanding off the stain, you're going to want to use a power sander with the orbital sander with the orbital discs. And in order to cut through that finish, there's different grits of sandpaper that you're going to want to use. Sandpaper starts all the way down at like 40 grit, and then it can go all the way up to 400 and above. Now, when you're at the lower numbers of sandpaper grit, that means that it's going to be very, very, very coarse and it's going to cut through stuff very quickly. You don't want to start with a 40 grit really on any furniture piece ever. I would recommend the lowest grit that you go would be about an 80 grit, but even with that, you want to still be really careful. On this, because it's veneer, I'm going to start with 120 grit sandpaper. I'm going to be using all Gator sandpaper, and this is the reptilian design. So the design of it really helps so that there is no buildup, and these pieces of sandpaper are very durable. They easily connect to the orbital sander with the hook and loop. And also they have the 8 holes so that it can kind of suck up some of the dust into the small bag that is on the sander. After I do the 120 grit, I'll kind of walk you through the steps. When you're going to stain something, you don't want to leave the wood grain wide open with a 120 grit. You want to start to close that up so that it's better for the stain to take to the wood. And also you want to make sure that there's no pigtail marks from the sanding. So then after the 120 grit, I'll go over the whole thing with a 180 grit. And then I'll finish off with a 220 grit and we'll be ready to stain the top. I'm gonna go over the sponge sanders when I'm ready to scuff sand the base of the piece. But let's get started on the top and chip it away at this finish with the orbital sander and the Gator sanding pads. One last thing before we get started on the top, don't forget your safety equipment. So I'm going to be wearing a mask to protect my lungs from the dust intake. And then also I'm going to be wearing safety glasses so that the dust doesn't get in my eyes. Now that I used all of the 120 grit to get the first layer of the top off, I am going to switch down to a 180 grit of sandpaper, and that's going to start to close that wood grain in order for this stain to take really well. And again, it's also going to make sure to smooth anything out that wasn't able to be gotten with the 120 grit. Sometimes there can be some sanding swirls if you went harder in one area, so this is just going to help me smooth that out. Before I do that though, I am going to wipe back the dust that's currently on the top. That way none of that dust gets caught underneath my sander and potentially adds even more sanding swirls. We just want to start with a clean slate. And what's really cool is I pretty much only used one sanding disc for the entire top. That's how durable this Gator sandpaper is. So I'm going to go ahead and take that off and put the 180 grit on. And we're going to smooth off the top. Now that the 180 grit is all gone through on the top, I am going to move down or up in grit to a 220 grit. And remember, we're getting finer as we go along. So this is going to continue to close that wood grain. I'm going to switch that out. And this is the last grit that we're going to be using on the top. I also decided that I wanted to add a pop of stain on the inside of the dresser. So when you open the doors, these two drawers are in there. So I went ahead and sanded down with a 120 grit and a 180 grit. So I'm just gonna finish off with the 220 grit just like I did with the top of the dresser there. The raw wood sanding is all finished. That took a little while, but that sandpaper really cuts through it well and it speeds up the process quite a bit. Now I'm moving on to scuff sanding. So this is going to be a little bit different than the sanding that I just did, because you can do it with an orbital sander, like a power sander, but you don't necessarily need to. So what I am going to use is a sponge sander to scuff sand. And the scuff sanding is simply to maybe sand out any minor imperfections, but mostly it's to give the surface a little bit of tooth, a little bit of something for that primer and paint to grab onto the surface. A lot of the times furniture already has a coating on it that's like a top coat or a poly, and it is completely smooth and oftentimes even glossy. So if it's glossy, there's really nothing for the primer to grab onto. There are tons of different grits for these sanding sponges. They're super durable. I'm going to be using a 120 grit, and this is going to give it just enough tooth, but not too much to where we're making scratches in the surface, but just a few little markings, and you'll be able to tell a difference, like where you've sanded versus what still needs to be sanded and kind of roughed up a little bit. Scuff sanding is finished up, but now I am going to go ahead and wipe back all of the dust. We want to make sure that the dust is all gone so that the primer and paint, again, can adhere. It's all about making sure that the product we're going to apply is going to adhere really, really well. So I've got these little rags that the sanding dust sticks right to, and I'm just going to wipe it back everywhere where I scuff sanded. We're getting down to the last few steps of prep work, but first I am going to cover the top that we just sanded, because like I said at the beginning, we're going to be priming and painting the bottom here, but since I already sanded off the finish and we'll be staining this, I don't want any of that to get sprayed on the surface. So what I like to do is just take some paper or plastic and then use some painter's tape and attach it. That way it's all covered. So we cut this to size and then just taking the painter's tape and taping it around the edges to make sure everything is secure. All right, and then the last step before we prime is that we're also going to need to wrap the drawers, because I don't want to get primer on the actual bodies of the drawers, only the drawer faces. So I'm going to be taking these drawers and using the same paper and tape method and wrapping it all the way around. Now I'm going to do this on all the other, I believe there's 6 more drawers. We are on the last step, which is primer. So I went ahead and did all the drawers and the top here. And then one more tip is to also put painter's tape on the insides of your drawers on the slides. That is so that they don't gunk up with the primer and paint that you're going to apply. And then you can take those pieces of tape off when you're ready to put the whole dresser back together. We are going to be using the Rust-Oleum Universal Bonding Primer, and I chose to use the color gray because I am going to be going with a darker paint. So instead of going with a white primer, I wanted there to be a little bit less of a drastic change between colors. So gray it is, and this is the 5-in-1 custom spray nozzle. So that means that there's 5 different ways that you can actually spray the paint or the primer onto the piece of furniture. And that is perfect because on this specific dresser, there are so many different surfaces that need to be covered, and each one of these in the nozzle can be sprayed for specific purposes. So when I go on, there's 5 choices. So there's a high output, a standard output, a low output, and then a vertical fan and a horizontal fan. So when I go onto the sides, I'm going to use the horizontal fan. So I'm going to start at the top and kind of bring the spray can up and down. But I'm going to make sure to stay 6 to 8 inches away from the actual surface so that we're not putting too much product onto the surface, which can also cause drips. Now that I've got that flat surface all sprayed with the horizontal fan, I'm gonna turn my nozzle to the number 3, which is a low output, because I'm gonna be doing these smaller sections here and I don't wanna put too much product on my surface. So we're just gonna switch this over, like so, and then go ahead and spray it. So I used the horizontal spray pattern on the up and down parts of the sides of the dressers. So coming over to the drawers, I want to cover as much as possible. So I'm going to be using the vertical spray pattern. So I've switched it to number 4 and we're going to spray vertically like that.